communication, right? Nobody's in the wrong room. We're going to start by passing this around. This is just if you guys are interested in some of the free resources from ISRC, if you wanted to sign up with your email address for our electronic newsletter, or your mailing address if you want our printed actual newsletter. So I'll pass those around.
That's what we did yesterday.
We also have some handouts. I know some of you have them on a device, an iPad or something, so if you don't need a handout, if you could save one for the people who don't have that. If you would like a handout, feel free to take one. They're also available on the IFE conference page and on our website. So if you can't get them today and you would like them in the future, or to pass it along to other people in your programs, feel free to do that. Again, I'm Raven Stromek. I'm here with the Illinois Service Resource Center. My background is I'm a teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing by trade. I have a master's in reading, and I currently work as a deaf and hard of hearing behavior coach for the Illinois Service Resource Center. The Illinois Service Resource Center supports deaf and hard of hearing students' behavioral needs across the state of Illinois, and yes, we actually really cover the entire state of Illinois. We provide free services to parents at home and also staff within the school system. The type of support that is quite the continuum, but it's all free, so that's really nice too. So many things, and there are so much to talk about that I don't want to spend too much time about that, but just so that you know, we do like data collection coaching. We come in and help develop action plans for behavior concerns. We have a lot of online resources, free CPDUs. We have a lending library with a lot of materials that might be good for you, or also to share with parents or other professionals in the building. So a lot of things like that that you could take advantage of. I think I skipped to. The slide before that was about the services that we provide families at home. So similar things at home where we could go and work with parents through some coaching opportunities to help them better address difficult behavior with their deaf and hard of hearing children. We only work with children who have a hearing loss. I know that's a question that we get very often. Well, what about deaf parents of hearing children? That doesn't count either. Our grant is specifically funded for children who are deaf and hard of hearing. They can have additional disabilities or diagnoses. The hearing loss does not have to be a primary or a secondary. We're not real particular about that, so it doesn't really matter how that falls on their IEP. That's another question that we get often. How students qualify for our services is that you want them to have our services and that they have a hearing loss. So today we're going to talk about memory in deaf and hard of hearing learners. I came across this great article by Harley Hamilton, and it just had so much information, and I know it's the kind of thing that we're always talking about with our deaf and hard of hearing learners, so I thought I would kind of read through it with a fine-tooth comb, put together a bunch of kind of highlights for you guys, and then some resources and ideas that you can use to apply the information from the article. So that's kind of my plan for today. I hope that's what you guys thought you were getting into. I did have some activities. We'll try our best to play around with it, but we have no tables and not a lot of room. So it may just end up being kind of a show and tell more than you guys actually doing the activities, but we'll do our best. This is the link to the actual article that I used to gather all of this information. I thought that would be important for you guys to have, and rather than print, I think it's 20 some odd pages for everybody, I thought I'd just give you the link. So again, you can have it in your PowerPoint. I'm sure that's kind of small to see, but if you get it electronically, like through the IFE webpage or our website, you'd just be able to click, and it is a direct link. So when we're talking about memory, we have a couple of different ways that they categorize it. So the first is working memory. That's like actively what you're doing right now when current, in the moment, what is going on, that you take that information and you put it into action. So trying to figure out what to do with the information that you're gathering. It's how much information the students can use. So it's kind of like a load or a capacity. You see these signs on the side of the road like 2-ton truck limits, that kind of thing. It's how much information can the students hold on to right now and still manipulate and use for their learning. Then with short-term memory, that's kind of what they can hold on to and how long they can hold on to it to be able to use it. So both of those indicators help you understand how well your students will be able to perform. When they do memory tests on deaf and hard of hearing students, how they perform on these memory scales helps to predict how well they'll perform academically, because how much they can hold that information and actively engage with that information really helps develop reading, literacy, comprehension, things like that, which makes perfect sense to us, and it applies then across the curriculum no matter what subject you're talking about. How can they hold that information and do something with it? So in Harley Hamilton's research, there were some specific areas that were identified as weaknesses for students who were deaf and hard of hearing and strengths for students who were deaf and hard of hearing. We're going to get into them more specifically individually, but I wanted to give you kind of the overall. If you're kind of a whole to part person, this is what the nuts and bolts of the article kind of outlined. That the weaknesses of deaf and hard of hearing students, the strengths, and then also the last two at the bottom were found to be strengths, but only if the students were specifically taught how to use those strategies. They were not strategies that deaf and hard of hearing students just sort of naturally acquired or picked up like a lot of hearing students do, but if deaf and hard of hearing students were taught to apply those strategies, they did see growth and benefit from that. So we're going to start with the weaknesses. Sequential memory was one of the big weaknesses. Deaf and hard of hearing students can remember things, but remembering them in a particular order was very difficult. So if they had to remember a list of numbers or letters and regurgitate them in exactly the order that they were given, that was very difficult for them. They scored below hearing students on that performance piece of it. And then you can see in the sub-bullet points all of the areas that would have a negative impact on our students for learning, whether they're trying to do math or reading printed word, even with finger spelling, to kind of flip-flop and mix up the letters while they're trying to receptively take that in is a challenge for them because of this deficit area. Processing speed was also shown to be lower in deaf students than in hearing students. So this also, how quickly you can pick up information. I'm a fast talker, and I am a fast signer too, and that is problematic for our deaf and hard of hearing students. We have to remember to take a breath and give them some of that wait time, give them those seconds to kind of process what we're saying, give them time to think about what we're trying to tell them. And we know that so many of our students are delayed in so many areas, and we only have so many minutes a day that we really try to, I've got a lot of laughing and head nodding, we really try to cram it in, don't we? So we go like 100 miles an hour, and we're really working against ourselves because they can't process that quickly. Hearing children can't process that quickly, and so we're like really trying to cram it in for our deaf and hard of hearing students, and that makes it even more difficult for them. Attention. This was so interesting. At the very bottom, when you have a deaf student attending to their signing peers, the research was able to identify that they would attend to about 30% of that discussion. If the teacher was signing, it upped to about 44%, and even still in a one-on-one situation, the amount of attention that you had, like a staff to a student, in isolation, one-on-one, they would attend to about 50% of your message. So I thought that was really interesting too. We're like, I tell them, and they just didn't hear me, or they just weren't paying attention. True story. The research says that. Yes?
Did they compare that to hearing kids?
You know what? If they did, let me see up here. So we have the deaf of deaf is 14.1% with ADHD. Deaf of hearing had 38.7% were identified with ADHD, and the deaf were better at peripheral than hearing. That's all that I pulled out of it. Look back in the article to see if they did say, I was actually just thinking that when I started saying, I'm not sure that they did say how that compared to hearing, but that it was less than the hearing population. So they did have that comparison, but I'm not sure if they gave the actual numbers or not. talking about that memory load, so how much information our deaf and hard of hearing students can hold on to when they're trying to work through and learn new information. They were giving the example how in hearing students, like those tongue twister kinds of things, sentences that sound similar make it more difficult for hearing children to hold on to and process. And with deaf and hard of hearing students, they found a similar connection when you have visually similar sentences. So the example that we have up here is, I ate apples at home yesterday, ate apples home yesterday. All very similar. That is very difficult for deaf and hard of hearing students. So it's like the equivalent to a tongue twister, but in sign language, which I thought was really fascinating. And so the higher memory load that we're requiring, the more of a deficit that we see in their abilities. Does that make sense? And so then when we have these kind of tongue twisters in sign language, that is actually increasing that memory load and making it more difficult for them to kind of keep up with us and to acquire the information that we're trying to share. Oh, the other thing, the very last bullet point, when they were testing this between hearing students and deaf students hit that frustration level sooner than hearing students too. So that's something to consider, because a lot of us, we grew up as a hearing person, we're surrounded by a lot of hearing people, we tend to kind of make those comparisons, and we're always trying to hold our deaf and hard of hearing students to that hearing standard, but it's important to understand that fundamentally they do kind of hit that maximum overwhelmed, kind of frustrated piece with the working memory load quicker than hearing students. They did find a lot of strengths that deaf students had over hearing students, which is always awesome to find out, like, yeah, we totally beat them, right? Because we're always trying to catch up. We're like, oh, well, the hearing kids are doing this. Oh, well, the gen ed kids are doing that. Like, we're better than them at this. So that's always really exciting, because when we can build on those strengths and when we can have those that foundation to build from, it helps make up for some of those weaknesses. And a lot of times we spend so much time talking about what our students can't do and how we need to fix that. Really, if we can find out the things that we're good at and build from that, that's going to be really helpful too. So free recall. I was talking about sequential recall. We give them a whole bunch of numbers or a whole bunch of letters. If they could just tell us those numbers or letters in a random order, they're champions at that over deaf and hard over hearing students. But not if they have to remember it in the particular order. This is a really awesome strategy for like body parts, the states within the United States, things like that, where they have to memorize lists or groups of information, but it doesn't really matter what order they give it back to you in. That's something that deaf and hard of hearing students outperformed hearing students. Visuospatial recall. So objects presented in this sort of graphic representation, they were superior to hearing students. So they could, one of the examples that they gave is if they had a bunch of objects on a grid and the facilitator or the proctor would touch the different objects, the deaf or hard of hearing student could follow that pattern and touch the different objects. So seeing things graphically or visually and kind of internalizing that representation and then being able to follow directions and use it is really helpful. And we know that we try to make everything so visual, and this is one of the reasons why that's really helpful for them. And I'm going to show you some examples of this kind of a task later too. That same thing, they can perform the same or similar to hearing students on the game Simon, which I brought one with me today, so a couple of you can maybe try to play with that. You would think maybe our students would be at a deficit, because if you remember, the Simon game has that like wah, 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 wah. And so, I know, thank you very much. That's why you're all here today, I know. So we, as hearing people, tend to rely on that auditory input as well, but for our deaf and hard of hearing students, just seeing those color representations is enough for them that they're able to perform similarly to their hearing peers, even without that auditory support. So that's kind of exciting, because I would not have expected that to be the case, because we're using multiple modalities to succeed at that. They can perform just as well as us, even without having that auditory input. Another interesting thing, the example at the bottom, so they were talking about if they presented a whole list of shapes or different graphics, the deaf and hard of hearing students could perform similarly to their hearing peers if it was static. So if you showed triangle, triangle, circle, and then you left it there, and they had to, and then like you took it away, and then they had to remember they could do it. But if you showed triangle and took it away, triangle, took it away, circle, took it away, and then asked them to tell you the pattern, that made it more difficult. So if you showed all three at once and then took them away, rather than show them in isolation, they were able to perform similarly to hearing peers. Imagery. Anybody who teaches reading or language, which is all of us in this room, we're always talking about making those movies or making those pictures in our head. Deaf and hard of hearing students can perform equally or superior to hearing students in this kind of idea. They're able to kind of take the information that they know and play it back in their head. This is really good for learning. Sometimes it does get to be a barrier when I look at things behaviorally, because I will have students who you give them a direction and they will not perform the direction until in their mind they've already played their movie. Okay, what's that going to look like? Okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to do this, and then they'll perform. So it seems like this resistance or this lag time, when sometimes it's just them practicing with their movie in their head. So something to think about when you have students who seem kind of resistant or hesitant to engage in an activity for just those first few brief moments. Maybe they're kind of practicing with their movie in their head, so something to kind of think about. And also mental rotation. So taking an object, like a 3D object, and be able to think about what the other sides of it would look like, what would happen if I moved it this way or that way. Deaf and hard of hearing students were able to outperform hearing students in that task. Using sign and speech for like spelling lists and different lists of words, deaf and hard of hearing were able to outperform hearing. I'm not sure what the hearing equivalent would be. I'm not really sure why a hearing child would benefit from signing and speaking at the same time when you're giving them a list, but that's what they said, so that's what I'm sharing with you. One of the barriers that they did talk about at length is that idea of simultaneous communication, and how some of the barrier for our deaf and hard of hearing students in this area is not so much their inability to do it, but our inability as hearing people to simultaneously sign and speak exactly what we're saying. And this is an age-old piece of information that we all know is a challenge that every day we're trying to overcome and figure out new strategies for, but that it's the SimCom users that create any kind of barrier that sort of comes from this piece of information, generally speaking. Of course, there's going to be exceptions to that rule, but that it's the skill level of people using simultaneous communication is sometimes what puts a lag in that area. As I mentioned in the beginning, there were a couple of strategies that if deaf and hard of hearing students were specifically taught the strategies, that then they were able to perform and outperform hearing students. So phonological encoding, some deaf students develop this and some students do not, is what they were sharing in their research. But that it is something that has to be directly taught. This is not something that they're just going to kind of pick up on their own, but when we teach that to them, that then deaf and hard of hearing students are able to use that to their benefit as an area of strength. And then it also was sharing that when they use those strategies, it helps overcome those areas of the sequential recall and reading comprehension. So I thought that was important to know, that when we can teach them those strategies, these are kind of the two benefits that we see from that. Rehearsal is also another strategy. So that's something that growing up, I know I did a ton of. If I had a test or a quiz or something to study for, I would have flashcards or have somebody quiz me or some Cornell notes or something like that. It's just kind of that rote drill. Deaf and hard of hearing students, for whatever reason, need to be taught to use that strategy more so than hearing students. And the other interesting piece about this was that deaf and hard of hearing students need to be actively engaged in that. It can't be something where they can just like sit back in the back of the classroom and think in their mind, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. They need to actively be doing something, using flashcards or matching or what. They need some overt way to be practicing those skills. It cannot be where you just sit and in your mind think about it again and again and again, which is something that a lot of hearing people do. But for our deaf and hard of hearing students, they need that outward, physical, interactive practice with the rehearsal. And then also, when deaf and hard of hearing students were noticed to start using rehearsal on their own, it was later in life than their hearing peers. So that was interesting too. Maybe because of the language delays, or I'm not really sure why, but it was interesting to see that when they do start to do it naturally, they start much later in life. So what does that mean for us as teachers of the deaf and hard of hearing? All of these skills are really related to language development, language comprehension, comprehension in general. When we're talking about attention, our students are so easily distracted because they take in so much of their environment visually that any of you who work with a deaf or hard of hearing student in the gen ed environment, that's like constantly where the teacher's like, well, he's always looking around the room. Well, when I put him in the back of the room to work with this group, they're so nosy. Why are these deaf and hard of hearing kids so nosy? They're always asking me what I'm talking about. They're always looking over their shoulder to see what their peers are doing. Because that's how they get there. I mean, we know why they're doing that, but for a lot of the gen ed teachers, that's a big frustration for them. They don't understand why our deaf and hard of hearing students are so distracted. And so part of that is this information that came out of this research, that they do tend to look in the periphery. They have a wider peripheral vision than the rest of us, so they see those little things going on outside of the tunnel vision that we would wish they would have sometimes. And so they get distracted by those things because they want to see what else is going on in their environment. And that is not a bad thing, but it's a barrier that we need to be aware of when we're trying to prepare the educational environment or talk about seating for our students in the classroom. A lot of times we talk about preferential seating being in the front of the room, but I have had several students that was actually not a really good place for them to sit because they were so distracted by everything that was happening behind them that they were constantly doing this, and then the preferential seating did nothing for them because they missed everything that was in front of them because they wanted to be able to access the visual cues from their peers and the room, what else was going on. So definitely something to think about when we talk about preferential seating, that deaf and hard of hearing students are shown to have that extra periphery and that's kind of important for them. The processing speed we talked about, for them to be able to encode in reading, because it takes them so much longer, you lack that kind of fluency and that fluidity that we know is important even for hearing children, because if they're struggling to figure out letter for letter, sound for sound, word for word, the comprehension significantly decreases. Because our deaf and hard of hearing students naturally have a slower processing speed, that makes it even more difficult for them. Then when we think about the sequential recall, the fact that they have to remember this information in a particular order. You cannot just speak or write sentences and willy-nilly recall. You have to put them in the order that they're supposed to go in. That's a difficulty for our deaf and hard of hearing students. So now we know some of the reasons why we have some of the barriers and the challenges that we do, which maybe then helps us design interventions to overcome that. So I kind of alluded this a little bit before, but one of the things that makes this so important is because now we know some of the things that our deaf and hard of hearing students struggle with and why, but now we also know what some of their really good relative strengths are that we can build on to try to overcome some of those deficits and some of the skills that we need to teach them in order to help them perform better in a lot of different tasks, specifically linguistic and language learning tasks. For the next few strategies, I'm not going to talk about every single one on the slide, but if you see one up there, I kind of highlighted the ones that I wanted to focus on. But if you see another one on there that you want to talk about or ask me questions about, feel free to interrupt. Yes? Can I move? Can I grab my drink real quick while I'm moving around? Thanks. No problem. So one of the things that they were talking about with language arts is that idea that we were talking about with the functionally similar hand shapes for communication. And, oh, sorry, I'm looking at the one that says this is your next slide, and we're not there yet. So the ASL mechanism of listing things on a list. So many of you probably use this strategy, but it's the idea of you need to hang up your backpack, put your homework in the homework folder, sit at your desk, take out your pencil, read page 52. When we actually use this listing things on our hand, that's a really good strategy for our students. A lot of us just kind of do it, and somebody showed us to do that, and so that's what we did, but it's actually a really good strategy for our students when learning language. It's like a proven strategy to help our students be able to maintain that list and know how many things they were supposed to do. Hearing people use similar strategies to that, but this, like for our signers, that's a really good strategy. As we talked about before, the formationally similar signs actually increase the working memory load. So something to think about if we do find ourselves having those tongue twisters. And you'll notice if you use a lot of sign language when you do kind of get, and you're like, oh, that's a hard word to spell. And that's a hard word to finger spell. Or, ooh, that was an awkward sentence. I kept getting fumbled up. When we notice that happening to us, make sure that you pay attention to that with your students and try to either slow down or maybe write it in print too, some other way to kind of support that so that they don't have to struggle with it too and understand that that's going to be a little bit different for them. For our hearing students, when you think about like a spelling list, all the time we're doing like the rhyming words and the word families, right? Cat, bat, sat, mat, hat. For our deaf and hard of hearing students, that's going to make it a little bit more difficult because they are so similar. That doesn't mean we don't want to teach them that, because of course having that unit and having that rhyming and that repetition and that pattern is going to be helpful for them, but understand that when we're presenting that information to them, because of the similarities, that's going to be a little bit difficult for them to kind of keep straight in their mind. For reading, we talked about with practicing automaticity and that fluency, how because of the processing speed, that's something very difficult for them. There were a couple of strategies that they were talking about to drill vocabulary and to kind of try to increase that, which I thought was really helpful. They said to put a bunch of your vocabulary words on a PowerPoint, but set the timer to automatically change after so many seconds. What a simple and great strategy that we can use as a center even. So we have all of these students in our classrooms, all of these different levels, and we're like, oh, how do I clone myself to be in 4 places at once? This would be a great strategy that you could use on an iPad or on a laptop or a classroom computer that could help them practice that drill of the vocabulary where it's going to automatically switch the slide after so many seconds, and you can have it to loop and repeat so that they'll still have repeated exposure to it, but it helps them know that they have to remember it faster. So we're actually working on that speed piece of it. I'm sure plenty of you already use PowerPoint to practice vocabulary and have it like flashcards, but having that speed piece of it and helping them know they have to do it quickly is an important part of this. Another thing would be to write something on a whiteboard and then erase it if you need to be a little bit more low tech. Maybe if you don't have an iPad or you're an itinerant or something, you're traveling, you don't have all of, we already have 27 bags, we don't need one more. But if you just had a whiteboard or something like that, we could write it and then after so many seconds erase it. You could use your phone or something to kind of set the timer so that you knew you were consistent with it. I don't know how many of you use this strategy as travelers, but I like to use those plastic page protectors and put templates and things in there, and then it becomes your mobile whiteboard. And it's like so light and easy, and you can put different templates or different fun, funky paper. If your students happen to love a particular character or a particular sports team, you can really increase their motivation just by having them write on a piece of paper that's fun, that's fancy, and you don't need 100 copies of it. You can just slide it in one of those plastic page protectors. It makes a great mobile whiteboard. So this was interesting too. In behavior, we talk about errorless learning. I mean, we talk about it in academics too, but really heavily in behavior, we talk about errorless learning, and they were talking about how that's so important for our deaf and hard of hearing students with writing, because practice makes permanent, right? We like to say practice makes perfect, but if we're practicing the same mistakes over and over and over again, practice makes permanent. So if you're practicing it incorrectly again and again and again, even if it's the wrong thing, that tends to be the way that you then do it from now on. So they were saying, especially with writing, practicing that errorless learning. There was this really interesting simple sentence lab resource that they gave, and it's almost like predictive text. So if the students start to type the troll, and then it's going to give them different options. Did the troll run? Did the troll hop? Did the troll jump? And then it will automatically help with conjugating and changing the verbs so that it'll be correct. So then it gives them, the next predictive, which word do you want next and which word do you want next, and it helps give them choices, but also guiding them through the process so that they can do it accurately every time. I don't know how flawlessly it works. I played with it for just a few minutes, so I can't promise you that it's perfect. They say it's great. I'm going to pass it on to you. Try it out yourself before you decide it's the strategy for all of your students. But it seemed like a really neat strategy for kind of some early literacy things to help our students be able to figure out how to make those correct sentences. They specifically mentioned the Fairview Method, which I thought was exciting. I know a lot of people in Illinois have really found benefit to using the Fairview Method, and so they were talking about kind of that chunking. So instead of some very specific stand up, but chunking it to be conceptual, stand up. And so those are the kinds of things that they said were actually really beneficial to our students, was to be able to teach them kind of to translate back and forth between those conceptual multiple signs for one word, and then the opposite, one word that requires multiple signs. That teaching them that particular strategy and concept was really important and was of great benefit to them. Visual imagery, so they talked about having displays for reference, which is something that I talk to teachers a lot about, because we think because we sign, our message is visual. And it is to a certain extent, but it still goes away, just like spoken words do. And so I get a lot of pushback, like, well, but my students can read, or well, but my students can whatever the excuse is. I don't need to have all of those posters, or I don't need to have all of those checklists, or I don't need that. My students are too old for that. And the research is actually showing that that permanency is really important, having something permanent that they can refer to. We do it for hearing students too, but I think we're nervous because we don't want to give our deaf and hard of hearing students a crutch if they don't need it. So we're always looking for things that we could be like, oh, they don't need that. They're beyond that now. We've surpassed that strategy. But it's actually a really good strategy for them and something that we want to do more often. We want to make that message permanent. Fred Jones talks about in one of his books, Teaching Tools, a visual instruction, a visual information plan, and he is writing about hearing students, but he talks about how when you're teaching long division or when you're teaching borrowing or different things like that, to actually put it on a piece of paper, step by step by step by step by step. This is exactly the steps that you need to do to complete this piece of information for writing, for math, for reading. Specifically letting our students know what the expectation is while we're teaching, making a visual representation of it that they can reference back again and again. Sounded very similar to me of the strategy that they were talking about in this article of having some sort of reference point for our students. Another interesting piece, the ASL feature of referring to objects in a particular place. So when you're talking about math and you're saying we have 3 apples and we're going to like put our apples over here, and we have 2 apples and we're going to put these apples over here, and then bringing them together, that idea of using space to show where your objects are is actually a strategy that's really supportive. So we do it because it makes sense and we were taught to do that, but it actually has been shown to increase their scores and their ability to learn math when we use that strategy specifically in math. I think, at least for myself, I feel like more like in storytelling and things like that, I would really be aware to do that. But I don't know, maybe I did do that in math and I just didn't realize it, but I really wanted to kind of draw that to your attention, that in math they were saying that putting the objects in a particular place and using that kind of ASL feature was really beneficial to our students. For social studies, again, I talked about this with a couple of the examples earlier. A great strength of our students is in social studies because a lot of the information in social studies does not necessarily have to be recalled in a particular order. Now, if we're drilling them on war dates or something like that, of course, that's going to be a little bit different. Maybe we can support that with a timeline or a graphic organizer to make the message more permanent. But when we're talking about learning states or body parts or different cultures or different things like that, they can recall that information really well as long as we don't require it to be in a particular order. So if the order is important, certainly require that of them, but something to think about is we may be putting our deaf and hard of hearing students at a disadvantage if we're requiring them to recall it in a particular order when that's not necessary. So something to think about, is our intention that they just recall all of this information, or is our intention that they're going to recall this information in a particular order and make sure that we're evaluating them based on what we actually want to know and not putting that added demand on them when we don't need to. General attention, so this was kind of fun. They were talking about teaching them to sustain attention, and they had this example of, as a teacher of the deaf, that you would stand next to a PowerPoint, and while you were standing next to the PowerPoint giving directions to your student, that you would have some kind of random craziness going on your screen. A movie or a cartoon or flashing images, so that you could actually teach your students to attend to you, the speaker, instead of the craziness that was going on next to you. Now, do you want to do that in the middle of math while you're trying to teach them long division? No, it was specifically an isolated activity to help them learn to sustain attention for longer periods of time with increasing demands for distraction. Kind of cool, right? Because all the time we're like, oh my gosh, our kids don't pay attention, or they can only pay attention for a little while. We know it's a problem, but what do we do about it? And they had this strategy that they recommended, so I wanted to share it with you guys. Do some kind of fun activity with some crazy randomness going on behind you and help them learn to divert that attention to you, the speaker. Again, don't try to do that in the middle of an important lesson. Do it as kind of an isolated thing and gradually increase the amount of distraction that they would have to compete with. Eliminate multitasking. Really? Do we have to? As much as you can. I mean, of course, we can only do so much with what we can do. I think I might internally combust if I had to suddenly one day stop multitasking myself as a human being. I would just die. Part of the reason that I can drive around the state as much as I do is because I have audiobooks. Without audiobooks, I would be like, oh my gosh, do you know how many things I should be doing right now? Instead, I can be learning, or I can be relaxing with my audiobooks. I am a huge multitasker. I live for multitasking. Just the other day I was working, I had my iPad, my iPhone, my laptop. I was like, ooh, if my kids walked in right now, they'd be like, Mom, too many devices. Totally a multitasker. We tend to put that on our students. Of course, they need to learn to multitask. That's what we do as humans. But when we're trying to teach them new information, when we're trying to reduce that memory load so that they're ready and more able to access the information that we're giving them, we have to reduce this multitasking. So the example that I just gave recently with the social studies, if we need them to remember it in a particular order, require them to remember it in a particular order. But if they don't have to, let's not make them because we think that makes it easier for them, because it doesn't. Another example of this is with like recall. So we tell a story, we want them to remember 3 important parts. Do the important parts have to come back in a particular order? Are we talking about just remembering 3 things from the story? Or are we remembering 3 things in the order, a beginning, a middle, and an end? Think about it. Of course, sometimes we're going to want them to remember something from the beginning, the middle, and the end. What happened first, second, third. But if we don't care about that, don't make them do it, because it's increasing their memory load when we don't need it to be. Another example, the same thing. We want them to remember 3 things from the story. If they have to then write it down, we've now increased their memory load. Up here, they may totally remember 3 things. They may even remember them in order, but now we want them to write it down on a piece of paper. Totally different skill. So now we say, like, oh my gosh, they can't remember 3 things from the story. The story was only 3 pages long. Maybe they can remember 3 things, but the way that we're asking them to give it back to us is creating the barrier. Maybe writing is difficult. Maybe the physicality of writing. Maybe it's a student with OT or PT issues. Maybe the physical act of writing is putting an undue stress on them. So maybe they could verbally tell you and you could be their scribe. If they're a signer, maybe they could tell it to the iPad and make a video of themselves telling back the 3 pieces of the information that you wanted them to remember. So think about those kinds of things. When we think our students can't do it, whatever it is, let's think about why can't they do it? And is it actually the skill that we're trying to evaluate them on, or is it some other barrier that might be getting in the way? Does that make sense? And we do it all the time on accident because we just don't realize. We're like, oh, this will be a good way. We'll have them draw a picture of something that they remember. Drawing the picture might be really difficult. They might be better at telling us or tell us, and maybe that's really difficult. They might be better at drawing a picture. So we want the same information, but how we get it from them or how we give it to them, we want to think about how can we do that in the most friendly way that we're reducing that memory load. Because the more room that they have to play around with the information, the better they'll be able to process it and apply it and retain it. Focus on one strategy at a time. So when we are doing this strategy instruction for our deaf and hard of hearing students, we want to teach them one strategy, and then we want to give them ample amounts of time to practice it. And I don't mean ample amounts of time like 10 minutes today. I mean like 10 minutes over the course of several days, and then introduce a new strategy. We can't just pile, according to Harley, we can't just pile on all of these strategies, which is also, it's the like rabbit speed, you know, we're like, we got to give them all the strategies right now. We can't give them all the strategies right now. We have to give them one at a time so that they can play with it, manipulate it, practice it, apply it, and have it become something that they're able to utilize well. So they were recommending one strategy at a time and kind of spreading them out. There was a particular neurologist who was talking about increasing the memory abilities of people in general, and so I think there's like 10 of them. He gave us some good strategies that were for a hearing population, but I felt like would have no problem applying them to our deaf and hard of hearing students. So de-stressing, making things more enjoyable. Let's stop, like, hurry up, come on. De-stressing. We're having fun, they're having fun. Try not to make it so crazy intense all the time. Getting attention. Lisa Bendinelli is one of my heroes in this realm. I don't know if you know her. She's a teacher down in Eisenhower. She advertises things all over her room. So her students are working towards a prize. She has like little commercials, you know, like in the before math. Okay, guys, remember, blah, blah, blah. And like advertises the things that her students are working for, the expectations that she has. She puts posters up on her wall. She makes like discount coupons. She is an advertiser in her room. So this made me think of Lisa Bendinelli, where you know, grab their attention, give them hints, make things mysterious, increase that motivation. Color coding things. This is great for hearing kids. It's great for deaf kids. It's great for kids who have executive functioning concerns, which is a huge. I'm not even going to start talking about that because then I won't stop. Novelty, so wearing like a funny hat or having a scarf or like a Hawaiian lei, different things like that to draw your attention away from whatever else is happening next to you, but that students need to look at you. I use that a lot for students who are having a hard time turn-taking or talking over their peers in a group. Whoever is the talker has a talking stick, like from Girl Scouts. But with deaf and hard of hearing students, we can't have a stick. So what do? We'll have like a little construction cone that stands in front of your spot, or you have a little necklace that you wear, or something like that to indicate to the rest of the group, zip it, and we're looking at this particular person to help direct their attention. And then personal meaning, really tying it to the particular student's interests, goes a long way. I know, beat a dead horse, everybody everywhere talks about pulling in student interest. So did the neurologist. Relational memory is helping them make personal connections to the information. And then they also were talking about synapse, so brain breaks. I know you guys have probably all heard of like brain gym, different things like that. When we load full of information and we don't give them time, oh, bless you. And we don't give them time to kind of have a little zen moment for their brain, we're actually doing a disservice. He was recommending you do that every 10 minutes.
I was going to ask you, what was the time?
He was recommending that their synapse can deplete after as quickly as 10 minutes. There's also some other research that I like to spout all around the state that the average adult can attend to a self-selected high-interest topic for 20 minutes only. Self-selected, high-interest, fully grown, typically developing adult, 20 minutes. And we wonder why our kindergartners can't sit on their pockets. Right? So even if it's something we're really interested in, we can only attend for 20 minutes before we space out. We can then have the coping strategies to come back and chew gum or tap our pencil or, you know, shift in our seat or whatever it is, but 20 minutes is the sustained attention that we have. Imagine our kiddos who have a hard time coping and frustration and everything else compounded on that. We can only do it for 20 minutes.
How long does the break have to be?
You know what? I don't think that he said. And I just know from other strategies, for every kid it's different. So I'm immediately thinking of like the OT, How Does Your Engine Run program. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but it's like, you know, how are you feeling high or are you feeling low? You know, you're like, you have too much energy or not enough energy, and then what do you have to do to kind of bring your engine back to smooth running? So I would imagine for some students it's going to be different strategies and for different amounts of time to get that impact. It'd be something you'd have to kind of play with to see how your students respond. Practice remembering. I'm like, ooh, I think I need to do that. So actually giving our students opportunities to practice remembering things. Some of the examples they had was like in the grocery store. We need to get these 5 things. Can you help me, remember the things we would get? Which is something that we would tend to do maybe with our own children or nieces or nephews or different things like that. But it's an important strategy that we need to pull into the classroom, helping our students practice remembering. Study the most important thing to remember first, which was almost opposite of what I would expect. It makes sense because then your brain is like the most spongy right at the beginning, but then you would think, but then I'm going to think about all this other stuff and forget that very first thing. But they were recommending that you study the most important thing first. Here's a whole bunch of web resources. There's like a short-term memory test. There's an online Simon game, a face memory test. So I thought I'd share those with you. Oh my goodness, and now it's trying to take me to that web page. Oh, good. Okay. Here's some other ones, some different memory games and different color coding, some other Simon games, kind of some of those brain builders. And then here's a bunch of other strategies. Okay, so at IS